So my dissertation examined student engagement and outcomes in service learning courses. And kind of in accordance with what Lindley said, before I delve into kind of the details of the methods that I used in this study, what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about the context from which it emerged and the issues that it was trying to respond to. So, service learning is considered a high-impact practice, and what that term means is that it's associated with a wide range of student outcomes. It's believed to be able to facilitate, at least in some cases, students' personal, their intellectual, and their civic development. So I think it's an interesting practice in particular because there's evidence that it can facilitate students' sort of cognitive reasoning and their understanding of really complex social issues, things like poverty and food insecurity and systemic racism. And at the same time, it can also sort of increase their commitment to taking action to actually do something about those issues. So it has a lot of potential. I'm going to talk a little bit about how this works in theory. So service learning designs vary quite a bit. All of them are kind of characterized by this link between community-based service experiences and then classroom learning, where students are kind of engaging in all the types of activities we would typically see in a classroom. And it's through the combination of these experiences that students are sometimes going to experience things that challenge the ways in which they think about these complex social issues, right? So it's kind of challenging their prior beliefs and perspectives. That conflict or challenge, that produces cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance refers to the sense of discomfort or imbalance that comes when two or more cognitions conflict with one another. And so again, the idea is that students will respond to that dissonance by sort of reflecting on their beliefs. And as a result of that, they can develop kind of new, more complex or more accurate understandings of these big issues related to social inequality. So this is kind of demonstrating, I think, the ideal service learning process. And as it probably doesn't surprise some folks, especially folks who've used service learning, this is not always how it works. So we have evidence that this can happen, but we also have evidence that sometimes it can do the opposite. And the issue seems to lie in how students sort of engage in or respond to these experiences that provoke dissonance. So in theory, students are going to respond by kind of questioning and deconstructing and then reconstructing their existing systems of beliefs about inequality. In practice, what we know is some students, and this is kind of very consistently shown in qualitative research, kind of short-circuit that process. So they use things like denial or stereotypes or oversimplification, and as a result of that, they're able to sort of disengage from that process of really grappling with that conflict posed by their service learning experience. And so that kind of created the question that I started with in my dissertation. And that question was, why do some service learning students engage in these ways that lead to more complex understandings of social inequality, whereas other students don't, or they even do the opposite, right? And so if you're familiar with research on conceptual change, you probably see a lot of parallels between the process I just described, which is really embedded in higher education research, and then various models of conceptual change and how it happens. So that's really where I started with my work, was looking at that research and trying to look at what are some of the factors that might help explain this issue, this kind of variation in students' responses. And what I found is that epistemic cognition, or the ways in which we think about knowledge and knowing, are really central to that conceptual change process. And so I decided to use epistemic cognition as the framework for this research. Now, epistemic cognition is a pretty large umbrella construct, so there are many different lines of research that have stemmed from it. And in this research, I chose to focus on two of those. Epistemic beliefs refer to the beliefs that we have about knowledge and knowing. And so those are beliefs like, is knowledge something that is relatively simple and concrete and unchanging, or is it something that's complicated and dynamic, right? And also, where does knowledge come from? Does it have to come from an expert or an authority figure, or can it come from our own individual reasoning processes? And then related to that, how do we actually justify whether or not we know something? So when we look at those beliefs, right, there are decades of research showing that they impact a wide variety of learning outcomes. And in particular, they seem to be really influential when students are in environments in which they're grappling with problems that don't have easy solutions. And so in my head, I thought that that's evidence that this could be really influential within service learning environments. The second construct that I looked at was epistemic motivation. So epistemic motivation refers to individuals' willingness or drive to engage in various types of effortful cognitive processes. There are a variety of different epistemic motivations. You may have heard of need for cognition. That's a really common one. In this study, I focused on need for closure. So need for closure refers to how we respond to ambiguity. Individuals who are high in need for closure aren't big fans of ambiguity. They want to sort of be able to seize on the first kind of appropriate conclusion that they can come to, and then they often are very resistant to changing that conclusion, even if they're exposed to alternatives. So as you can imagine, I kind of suspected that need for closure may not equip students very well in service learning environments, which by design are sort of forcing students to grapple with really ambiguous situations. So the goal of my research kind of turned into examining the associations between epistemic cognition, especially students' epistemic beliefs and motivation, and the ways in which they engaged in service learning environments, the outcomes they had as a result of that. So to tackle this goal, I collected data from students in 16 different service learning courses at a large public university. And this is just kind of a snapshot of some of the data that I collected. So I collected surveys at the start and the end of the semester, and through those surveys, I measured students' epistemic beliefs and motivation when they started their service learning course. I also looked at their beliefs about inequality both at the start and at the end of the semester, and then during the semester, I selected 16 different students with very different characteristics, enrolled in 5 different service learning courses, and I interviewed them to get really detailed information about their experiences and how they were responding to them. So I went through this data and I wanted to answer kind of 2 large research questions. So what I'm going to do in the following slides is that I'll pose each research question, and then I'll sort of briefly go through the analyses and the findings that I used to answer each. So the first overarching research question was, to what extent do students with different epistemic beliefs and motivation at the start of the semester experience different service learning outcomes? And by outcomes, remember, I'm talking specifically about kind of these shifts or changes in students' beliefs about social inequality. And I answered this in 3 steps. The first thing I wanted to do was to identify what kinds of patterns of epistemic beliefs and motivations existed. So I used latent profile analysis to identify these patterns within individuals using that data I collected at the start of the semester about their epistemic beliefs and motivation. And then the second thing I did is, using those scales I used to measure their beliefs about inequality at the start and the end of the semester, I looked at how those beliefs changed overall. And then finally, I kind of put those two steps together to look at whether students' epistemic profiles at the start of the semester predicted their changes in their beliefs by looking at their end of semester beliefs and then controlling for their pre-semester beliefs as well as their demographics. So I'll give you a little bit more detail as we go. But what I'm going to do is sort of go through the analyses I used in each of these steps. So in step 1, I was able to identify 3 epistemic profiles. Now, I've named these based on profiles that have been identified in prior research, but I think it's important to note that I use different scales, so they're not entirely analogous. So the red line at the top there, those students are what I called realist. These are students who think of knowledge as relatively simple and certain, who do think of authority figures as a source of knowledge, and their need for closure is sort of slightly above average. So in this sample, that meant that they were kind of moderate to high need for closure. At the bottom yellow line, those students are skeptics. These are students who they recognize that knowledge is complex and uncertain. They do not think of authority figures as a good source of knowledge, and their need for closure is much lower than average. And then in the middle, we have rationalists. So they're kind of a mix. Like skeptics, rationalists recognize that knowledge can be complex and uncertain. At the same time, they see that there's some space for authority figures to be a source of knowledge, and their need for closure is identical to that of realists. In the second step, I looked at 3 different types of beliefs about inequality. So belief in a just world refers to the belief that the world is fair and people get what they deserve. And in service learning, we would like to see that belief decrease, both because it's inaccurate and because it's associated with some pretty negative tendencies like victim blaming. And then I also looked at the ways in which people kind of explain the causes of poverty. So there are 2 poverty attributions I looked at. One is individual attributions for poverty, and that's essentially when people blame the poor and the characteristics of poor people for poverty. The second is structural attributions for poverty. So this is when people look at sort of the systemic causes of poverty, things like access to jobs that pay a living wage. And what we would like to see, as you can imagine, is that students' reliance on individual attributions for poverty should decrease somewhat, and the recognition of the structural causes of poverty should increase. And what I found was, unfortunately, belief in a just world didn't seem to change at all if we just look at the overall sample. We do see the intended changes in students' attributions for poverty, but these changes are pretty small. And when you look at the data, there's a lot of variation in students' beliefs both at the beginning and the end of the semester, right? So in the next step, what I want to know is, do students' epistemic profiles at the start of the semester help us maybe predict or understand some of that variation? So I do this by essentially regressing students' end of semester beliefs about inequality on their epistemic profile membership. And I controlled for their pre-semester beliefs as well as some demographics. Now this looks a little different than a typical regression table because I used a procedure that allows me to control for error in profile assignment, but essentially the thing you want to look at is whether that first row, those 3 intercepts, are significantly different. If they are, then what that suggests is that there are kind of these epistemic profile differences in their beliefs at the end of the semester, even when we control for their baseline beliefs. So with belief in a just world, there is some evidence that there are differences. I found that realists had much, oh no. I could keep talking, but okay. It's not going to be as fun without the visuals. So realists had much higher belief in a just world at the end of the semester than the other 2 groups. As a statistically significant difference when we compare them to skeptics, it doesn't quite reach statistical significance when we compare them to rationalists. But this kind of suggests that their belief in a just world remains high compared to the other 2 groups. Now, when we run the same analysis for individual poverty attributions, we see the same effect, but magnified, right? So both of these are statistically significant. And then, because nothing can be simple, when we run it for structural poverty attributions, we see no difference between the 3 groups. So what does this actually tell us? It's not entirely conclusive, but I do think this provides some initial evidence that epistemic profile membership at the start of the semester seems to be associated with at least some of students' service learning outcomes. And in particular, students with realist epistemologies who think of knowledge as being relatively simple and certain seem to have kind of the least beneficial or least intended learning outcomes of the 3 groups that I looked at. Now, there are a couple of limitations that I want to briefly mention. One is that it is very difficult to measure epistemic beliefs reliably, especially at the domain general level. So I ran into some measurement issues that could have attenuated, essentially, that relationship that I was trying to detect between students' epistemic profiles and their outcomes. So that's just something that I think we have to keep in mind and interpret those findings with some caution. I think the second and larger issue is that while this provides us with some evidence that there may be a relationship here, it doesn't really tell us why, or what is that relationship? Right? Like, what does that actually look like? And so that really leads me to my second research question. And that research question was, when we look at students with various different epistemic characteristics at the start of the semester, how do they engage with or disengage from those service learning experiences that create dissonance, right? By conflicting with what they believe about some form of social inequality. So the way I went about assessing this question was that during those interviews I conducted with students mid-semester, I used a series of prompts that allowed me to identify specific experiences they had that provoked dissonance. And then for each of those 50 plus experiences, I went through the process of getting students to describe what happened, how they responded to it in the moment, how they responded to it after the fact, and what they took away from that experience. And I analyzed that data to develop a constructivist grounded theory of what I call dissonance negotiation. And that's the process by which students essentially respond to and make sense of these dissonance-inducing experiences. And then I looked at students' epistemic cognition. So I had those survey scales that I measured at the beginning of the semester, but I also looked at the interviews themselves. And I analyzed that using a framework proposed by Clark Chin and colleagues in 2011 that goes sort of beyond epistemic beliefs and motivation. And then I compared steps 2 and 3 to say, when we look at students' epistemic cognition, how is that related to their patterns of dissonance negotiation? Now, I'm not going to go into all of this. I will say that when I looked at dissonance negotiation, I essentially identified 3 steps. Students had to interpret the dissonance-inducing experience, so like what is this experience and what's happening here? And they did that in very different ways. They had to respond in the moment, which was often a very behavioral and emotional response, and then they responded after the fact, often by kind of cognitively making sense of that experience and trying to draw some kind of conclusion from it. And when you look at students and how they progress through those 3 steps, they do so in very different ways. So what I'm going to present now, although I don't have time to go through kind of all the findings, is that I'm going to review 2 of the key themes that emerged from that 4th step where I was comparing students' epistemic cognition to the patterns of dissonance negotiation that they demonstrated. So the first theme was related to students' beliefs about knowledge. And what I found was that students' epistemic beliefs seemed to be very much related to the ways in which they interpreted those dissonance-inducing experiences. So you have some kind of experience, you have to explain to yourself what is going on, why is this significant, why am I responding to this experience, right? And what I found is that students who think of knowledge as very simple and certain seem to often interpret those experiences as kind of a threat, as opposed to like an opportunity to learn. So this is really well kind of illustrated by Sarah. Sarah was a student who thought of knowledge as very concrete, something that doesn't change at all. She had very strong religious beliefs, and so she interpreted knowledge as coming from the Bible and from the teachings of her church. And also as a result of her religious beliefs, she often experienced very big conflicts between what she believed and what she was sort of exposed to in the context of this service learning course. And she did not see those conflicts like other students might as an opportunity to learn or to reflect on her beliefs. She saw them as kind of a nuisance at worst. She kind of used the word irritating a lot to describe those experiences, and as a threat, something she found very upsetting, kind of at the worst end of the spectrum. And as a result of that, she used a number of strategies to withdraw from those experiences or to disengage from that dissonance. So in the moment, she would often withdraw or kind of stop her participation entirely or just sort of go with the flow, so she could avoid having to really engage with other people. And after the fact, she often sort of sought reinforcement from people who shared her existing beliefs. And so I think what this shows is it kind of illustrates one reason why, when we look at students with these realist epistemologies who think of knowledge as very simple and concrete, these students might not be demonstrating the types of belief change that we would otherwise expect in a service learning course. The second theme has to do with students' epistemic motivation. So remember, going in, I kind of assumed that need for closure would not equip students very well to really deal with the very ambiguous and conflicting types of experiences they have in service learning. And what I found is it was actually a little bit more complex than that. So when students recognized that knowledge was complex, but they also had kind of moderate to high need for closure, these students were often very reflective about their experiences after the fact. And the way I interpret this is I think for some of those students, need for closure manifested as needing to reflect on their experiences so that they could draw a concrete conclusion. And this is really illustrated by Casey. It's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Casey found that it was very important to reflect on their experiences, to make sense of them, and to try to understand what they had experienced and what was going on and what they could take away from it. But at the same time, Casey, like a lot of these other students, was very uncomfortable with some of these experiences because ultimately they had to grapple with complex social problems that don't have an easy solution. So they weren't able to come up with a conclusion that was as concrete as they would have liked. Now, when we look at students who have low need for closure, what I found is that is also kind of a double-edged sword. So many of these students didn't have the level of discomfort that Casey had grappling with some of those experiences. They were much more okay sort of sitting with the ambiguity, and so they didn't feel the need to try to search for a conclusion. But the flip side of that is some of these students were not quite as reflective after the fact when you spoke to them. And so as a result of that, they would sometimes have pretty, not bad, but open-ended conclusions, things like, I think this is very complicated, or I'm not sure that we have a solution to this issue. And so I think what this tells us is, especially if I'm an educator, right, whether need for closure or some other form of epistemic motivation is going to be beneficial or not really depends on the learning environment. And it depends, in this case, on how important it is for our students to be able to draw sort of a concrete conclusion from their experiences. So in sum, this is what I hope to be the first step in an ongoing line of research looking at the factors that influence students' engagement and their outcomes in high-impact learning environments. And I think that these findings provide some initial evidence to suggest that epistemic cognition is something we really need to consider when we're looking at the effectiveness of these environments. And in particular, some students may have patterns of epistemic characteristics that make it a little bit harder for them to fully engage in and get the most out of these environments. So there are several directions that I would like to go in with this research. One is looking at how different epistemic factors intersect, so kind of going beyond epistemic beliefs and motivation to consider how things like epistemic aims and other factors intersect with one another and how they influence students' engagement. The second is I'm very interested in students' personal context, their backgrounds, beliefs, their identities, the things that they really take with them into the classroom. I want to know how those influence the ways in which they think about knowledge, and I think it's especially important to look at that among students whose backgrounds and identities are often not well represented in higher education. And then the third, something I'm working on right now, is looking at the classroom context, or what I call the classroom epistemic context, right? And to look at how things like disciplinary practices and instructional practices send messages to students about the nature of knowledge and knowing. And then I think importantly, to look at how students do or do not pick up on those messages. And so ultimately where I hope this research will lead is to give us some information about what teachers can do to really facilitate the types of epistemic cognition that allow students to really learn from high-impact learning environments. So in conclusion, I want to thank the many people who were really supportive of and instrumental of this research. Thank you so much.